Alright class, this is going to be a quick lecture of IPE. I'm going to go over a few things. I'm going to go quickly. I'm going to try and get the WebEx set up today. It's just not functioning the way I want. I apologize. I know we're way behind. So when we're talking about this IPE overview, there's a couple of things that I want to make clear so we're talking about the same thing in the exam, right? So right now we've really been focused on this American school and this British school and what are the differences. So let's get some basics, some sort of underlying things about IPE. So the first thing is that IPE deals in what we would call balance of payments, right? So balance of payments occurs through this process where one, you have revenues, right? And you have payments, right? And if your revenue isn't enough to make for your payments, and you have a balance of payment problems. So what do I mean by revenue? I mean taxes, tariffs, and rents, right? So taxes, right? We all know what taxes are. Tariffs are at some cost you add to imports and exports, right? So if you want to ship something into another country, that country might say, well, we are going to add 10% to that for whatever reason, and we're going to take some of that money, right, when you import into our country. And the last one is rent. And we've talked about rents before, right? If you have an oil well, the government can say, okay, I now own that oil well, and I'm going to sell that directly. That's called rent, right? I'm going to take this resource and I'm going to sell it and I'm going to collect directly. So this causes a couple of problems. The first one is that it's rent seeking. So when you're seeking out rents, right, whenever you find a resource, the government just takes that resource. So if you were in a country in which you knew that the government would take resources that were found, you might want to hide that resource. Or you may not want to invest in certain land or property because if they found an oil well, the government will just take it and you're not going to be compensated. So rent seeking is a little problematic. The other part, which we don't spend a lot of time talking about, which is in comparative politics, is this idea of a resource curse. So if you have an oil well in your country and it's making 10 million a year, let's just say that you're selling 10 million a year through this process, right? You hire a company to mine it and they pay you $10 million a year to use your oil well, right? So you're not actually setting up the oil well. You're not setting up infrastructure. You're not even really hiring people involved in the process. Some company is just paying you to access that resource, right? You claim ownership, but you have some company take care of it. So when you have this resource curse, what will occur is that you won't invest in other things. You won't collect taxes because if you don't collect taxes from your public, then they won't expect as much of you, right? They're like, oh, well, I don't pay anything in taxes and also I don't have this issue. So I'm not going to make demands of my government. But then you don't build infrastructure, you don't build highways, you don't build up a strong bureaucracy, you don't set up a system in which rule of law exists, you don't promote these things because you have this resource. And then you end up not developing, right? You don't build companies, you don't have this economic industrialization. So because of that, a resource curse can really cause problems long term, right? Look at Saudi Arabia. It has a lot of wealth, right? But that wealth hasn't translated into a lot of industry, right? There's not a lot of industry in Saudi Arabia. Now, there are other factors at play, but we see these resource curses happen a lot when you have oil because the selling of oil produces enough to run your government so you don't build other products and you don't set up industry or manufacturing. So there's two different functions. The other part is payments. So when you're paying out, a couple of things have to be paid. So if you have a military, right, you have to pay for that military. You have to pay them their cost. If you don't, right, then you have the problem of the Soviet Union and Russia. Your military will not serve you unless they're getting paid. So you have to make sure you're paying that cost. And the more authoritarian you are, the higher cost for military, right? You have to have this sort of coercive apparatus where you force people to behave. These soldiers have to be paid for that process. And usually they have to be paid more if you're an authoritarian regime than you're in a democratic regime, right? Because you have rule of law in a democratic regime. In an authoritarian regime, you have to pay them a little more to do things that they may not want to do. The other is provide services. So providing services could be buses, it could be building roads, but it could also be direct payments, right? We could talk about welfare or other prospects where you're giving people money. Now, this is very functional if you're a government. You say, okay, if you have a problem, we'll fix your problem. And then you have the support of the public because you're fixing the problems. And then the biggest problem that we see in balance of payments is debt. Right? Countries go into debt doing a lot of these things, and then all of a sudden they can't pay for everything. And there are a couple of countries called highly indebted poor countries. These are HIPCs. So they have a lot of debt and their debt is so massive that they will probably never get a chance to pay it off unless there's some sort of debt forgiveness. And it's cutting into how much their payments go into, right? If you have to make your credit card payment every month, or you have to pay on some bill every month because you went into debt in the past, all of a sudden you don't have as much money for other things like food and rent and groceries, right? So when this happens on a state level, it's very problematic. And then we run into a balance of payments problems. And a balance of payments just means that your monthly or your yearly or at some interval, your revenue is less than your payments, right? Balance of payments is revenue minus payments. So if all of a sudden the money coming in is less than the money going out, you have a problem. Now, when a human does this, there are a lot of ways to go about this, right? You can go bankrupt, but countries can't really go bankrupt. States can't really go bankrupt in the same way. So then we start talking about what happens after that. In the past, what has happened is that you'd have structural adjustment loans. So a structural adjustment loans, right, when we're talking about this article, is that it is a conditional lending. So what would happen is a state would say, I can't pay for my services and my debt, and I need a loan to sort of restructure this, a restructuring loan. And so what these international organizations, or these IGOs, right, the IMF and the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, what they would do is to say, okay, we'll lend you the money so that you can restructure, right, so that you can have money now, and then we'll set up a way for you to pay everything back, right? This is very problematic. So it's kind of like another loan to help you pay for all the debt that you have. But what they do is they say, you can't afford all of the services that you have. So it's a conditional lending. You can have this loan, but you need to fire 10% of your bureaucracy. You can have this loan, but you need to open up your trade, right? So it's always about reducing services, austerity, and opening up trade, right? So why would they make this argument? Why are they saying, okay, we know why they're saying reduce services, right? You don't have enough money, cut what you're offering, right? Tighten your belt, right? This is called austerity, right? If your country doesn't have enough money, you need to cut services, you need to go through austerity so that you can pay for the things that you really need, like roads, police, right? Basic services, right? So you need to cut other things like bureaucracy down. This comes from what we call the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus is this thought process, right? It comes out of the Chicago School, which these terms aren't as important right now. We'll talk about that historically in other classes. But the way that it works is that they have this epistemic community, right, with this knowledge community that we've talked about in the past. And they become pervasive in the IMF and the World Bank and everywhere. And it becomes this consensus of thought, this conformity of thought, right, which we're worried about, which obviously I'm giving some foreshadowing that it's been problematic. And part of it is that the way that you develop is through comparative advantage. So if you're a state that produces coffee or cotton at a high level, right, that you can produce it at a low cost or a high quality, then you should really get into that, right? You should invest, and you should not invest, but you should focus on that product, right? You should find that one product and you should make it really well, and you should trade it out to the world. And so your trade should be open. You should be open for a lot of imports so that other states will be willing to take your trade. So this is about opening trade and globalization, right? And then the other part is reducing overhead, right? So you cut the services, you cut the bureaucracy. All of a sudden, your state is spending less money on services, and it's making more money through the exports of these products. So this is a very simplified version of Washington Consensus. I'm doing a quick video because I want to have some opportunities to talk to you one-on-one. So this is the Washington Consensus. For a long time, the IMF and the World Bank operated this way. The only way that you could get a loan is if you agreed to this thought process, that we're going to open up to comparative advantage, and we're going to open trade and focus on one product, right? We're going to make one product really well and go through this. Now, it wasn't very functional. A lot of these states that accepted this Washington Consensus as their epistemic community sort of grew, right? This conformity of thought grew. They said, okay, we'll focus on our products, we'll open trade. They became more vulnerable to trade, right? But also, they didn't develop. And what happened is you had this alternative be very successful in the 90s, early 2000s, right? This is the Asian tigers, and it was called import substitution industrialization, which we've talked about before. So the way that import substitution industrialization works is that you say, okay, I'm not going to do comparative advantage. It doesn't seem to be working for me. What I am going to do is I'm going to make these low value added goods. And value added just means I take something like cotton and I make it into fabric, right? So it's a low value added good. I'm processing the cotton into fabric. It has a little bit more value, not a ton of value. It's not like making a computer that's a high value added good, right? But I'm making this fabric and then I'm going to export that, right? But what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take some of that money from that export and I'm going to invest in some new industry. I'm going to establish new industry. And Korea did this and China did this with automobiles. So what they said is, I'm going to take some of this money and I'm going to start an automobile plant, right? But because my automobile plant is very new, it can't compete in the international market. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my infant industry. And infant industry is an industry is not ready to compete on the global market, but you want to set it up. So what you see happen is in Korea and China and a couple of the other places, they put really high tariffs on foreign products. And for them, that means US cars, right? Because the US car manufacturing is the biggest in the world. So they start saying, we're not going to allow, or we're going to make it very expensive for US cars to come to our country and to our borders. And these are infant industry protections. And what you do is over time, you build a domestic market, right? It's so expensive to buy a US car, and it used to be called Daewoo in Korea, right? So you buy a domestic car, a Daewoo, and then over time you build brand loyalty and they start getting a more economy of scale as their manufacturing process gets larger, and then eventually in the early 2000s Daewoo can operate on the international market and then you open up trade. But while you're doing all of that, all of a sudden you have an industrialization. You have a market, you have manufacturing, you have infrastructure, right? Because you need a lot of infrastructure to build an automobile, right? So you've developed in the way that we expect you to develop. So import substitution industrialization in East Asia was very functional. It didn't work everywhere, but we do see this process happening. So this is an alternative to the Washington Consensus. Now, the reason why it was so important that you had an alternative was this theory that we called dependency theory. So dependency theory comes about, and I'm oversimplifying dramatically because I want to do a short video because I'm hoping to add a few things in the next week. So you get a good picture as we go into the final exam, right? A lot of you are at a point where you're through most of this. So I want to give you something to really grip into for the last part of the course. So dependency theory talks about this core and the periphery, and the core is the great powers, is the permanent five of the Security Council, right? That's US, UK, China, France, and Russia, right? And then the periphery are the people on the outside, right? All of the countries on the outside. Now, obviously, there's a lot more periphery than there is core. Core sets the rules, right? We know this. Great powers determine what the rules are, right? The World Trade Organization is set up in large part to fit with the interest of the U.S., right? Because you get voting bloc, right? If you want to vote in the World Trade Organization, it's determined on your size of your contribution. Your size of contribution is determined by the size of your economy. So the U.S. has a bigger vote than anyone else, and they can influence a lot of votes. So the core is really setting those rules. The other part, right, which is why dependency theory is against sort of this Washington Consensus, is because the periphery are vulnerable to trade fluctuations. If you're the US and you're going to buy less cotton because you're having a recession, that means because trade is so open, the countries that are producing cotton at a high volume, they still have to take all of your imports, but you're not buying their exports, right? So you're very, very vulnerable to global fluctuations if you're doing comparative advantage, if you've opened up your trade. That's also not the only way that it functions. So in dependency theory, there is this trade deficit problem. And it operates like these 5 steps. Step 1, you make a low value good. You make cotton, or you make some sort of fabric, or you make something that has a limited added value to it, right? Usually very labor intensive, right? You're making rugs, whatever you're making, and you sell that product to a core country, right? You're selling that, you're exporting that. If it's, let's say, fabric. So the core purchases those fabrics and they make high value goods like fashionable clothes, right? Or fast fashion or whatever it is. So they take your fabric and they make something at a high value added, and then they sell that. But part of what they do is they sell it back to you. And the best example is that there are a lot of countries that sell iron and bauxite to the US. The US then uses that to make machinery, and that machinery is very expensive, but it helps in the processing of iron and bauxite. So if you want to be competitive in the global market, you have to buy the machinery from the US. But the machinery is so expensive compared to the thing that you're getting out of the ground that you end up in a deficit, right? This is how it happens, right? So the core sells you this high value added good. You sold them something inexpensive, they sold you something very expensive, and then all of a sudden you don't have enough money to deal with the imbalance, right? You have more money going out than coming in your trade. So what you do, because you're trying to provide services or trying to set up an industry or whatever it is, you go into debt, right? And there could be a lot of other reasons to go into debt as well. But for this argument, right, it's about this trade imbalance. Every time I trade with someone, right, every time Zimbabwe trades with the US, Zimbabwe ends up with the worst deal, right? And this is realism in practice, right? The US only wants deals that make them better off. So if you're a weak power, sometimes you have to accept these deals that make you worse off than the US. But this relative becomes a problem when you have such a trade imbalance that you're starting to go into a lot of debt. And then the last step is structural adjustment. And this is really the big problem. You've set up a system, right? The argument of dependency theory is that the US and other great powers have set up a system where you're going into debt just to be comparative, right? To have this comparative advantage, you're going into debt and you're going into debt and you're going into debt. And then, because you're in debt, you need to ask for help, and the demand is structural adjustment. So you say, oh, I need to provide services, and I need to do all of these things because this product doesn't make enough money, so I need to add services for my public, right? So the Washington Consensus has caused this lack of services. And then all of a sudden, structural adjustment comes in and says, well, you need to cut those services, or else you won't be able to continue paying your debt. So dependency theory is this sort of fatalistic approach, right? That the periphery will always be periphery because the core have placed them in that way. So these are some arguments from IPE, some basic work, right? On Thursday and today, today is Tuesday, we're going to have a lot of discussions about how this functions. But for now, I just wanted this video to go over some basics, and then I hope to talk to you soon.